Sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is simply survive another day. In the cold village of Skarnfjord, 6 young sisters knew this truth better than most. Their uncle, Jarl Torsten, was supposed to protect them after their parents died. Instead, he ruled over them with cruelty and fear. The girls learned to stay quiet, move carefully, and never look him in the eye. They were aged 8 to 17, but all of them had grown old too quickly. Then a stranger arrived, seeking shelter for the winter. Asgeir the Silent was a giant of a man with scars on his hands and sadness in his eyes. The villagers saw just another wandering warrior. They didn't know he had once been the king's champion, or that he had given up everything rather than hurt innocent people. But Asgeir noticed what others ignored. He saw the fear in the sisters' faces and the way they flinched when their uncle raised his voice. What happens when a man with nothing left to lose decides that some fights are worth everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Skarnfjord sat like a weathered bone against the stark Norwegian coastline, where the fjord cut deep into the land like an old wound that refused to heal. Winter had settled over the settlement with the weight of a burial shroud, and the wind carried the promise of harder days to come. Smoke rose from thatched roofs in thin grey lines, each one a testament to families huddled around their hearths, grateful for whatever warmth they could kindle against the cold. In the largest longhouse at the village's heart, where the Jarl traditionally held court, 6 sisters moved through their morning duties, with the practiced silence of those who had learned that noise brought unwanted attention. Their names were carved into the memory of the village like scars. Astrid, the eldest at 17, whose brown eyes held the weight of premature motherhood; Ingrid and Solveig, the 15-year-old twins whose different temperaments had been beaten into similar submission; Ragnhild at 13, whose quick wit had been dulled by years of careful words; Bergliot at 11, still clinging to fragments of childhood hope; and little Sigrid, barely 8, who clutched a string of wooden prayer beads whenever fear overwhelmed her small frame. The beads had belonged to their mother, carved by their father's own hands during the long winter before Sigrid's birth. Each bead bore a simple symbol: a tree for growth, a bird for freedom, a star for guidance, and the youngest sister rubbed them smooth with constant touch. The other sisters knew that when Sigrid's fingers found those beads, she was remembering the woman who had sung them to sleep, who had kissed away their tears, who had promised them that love was stronger than any darkness. That woman had been gone for 3 years now, claimed by the fever that swept through the village like wildfire, taking first their mother and then their father within a moon's turning. Jarl Torsten was their father's brother, a man who wore authority like ill-fitting armor. Where their father had been known for his fair judgment and generous spirit, Torsten ruled through intimidation and barely controlled violence. His iron gauntlets, heavy, ornate things that had belonged to some long-dead warrior, hung from a peg by the great chair where he held his daily court. He wore them when dispensing justice, when settling disputes, and when reminding his nieces of their place in his household. The metal was always cold, even in summer, and it left marks that took days to fade. The sisters had learned to read the signs of his moods, like sailors reading storm clouds. When Torsten's jaw tightened in that particular way, they scattered like sparrows. When his fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, they knew to finish their tasks quickly and quietly. When he reached for those gauntlets, they knew to make themselves invisible or face the consequences of his displeasure. Astrid bore the heaviest burden, having appointed herself the shield between her younger sisters and their uncle's wrath. She had grown thin from worry and sleepless nights, her once bright smile now carefully rationed for moments when Torsten was not present. She spoke little but watched everything, memorizing which words brought punishment and which silence brought them peace. The responsibility of keeping her sisters safe had aged her beyond her years, and sometimes the others caught her staring out the small window with the hollow look of someone who had forgotten how to dream. The twins, Ingrid and Solveig, had once been as different as summer and winter. Ingrid had been bold and quick to laugh, while Solveig preferred books and quiet contemplation. 3 years under Torsten's roof had blurred those differences until they moved and spoke almost as one person. Their individual spirits merged into a single strategy for survival. They shared glances that needed no words, communicated in touches and gestures that bypassed the need for dangerous speech. Ragnhild had possessed a clever tongue that could make adults laugh and children believe in magic. That gift had been beaten out of her through painful lessons about speaking without permission. Now she saved her words like coins, spending them only when absolutely necessary. Her silence was different from her sister's, not the careful quiet of fear, but the deliberate withholding of someone who knew the power of what she kept locked away. Bergljot still carried traces of the child she had been, though they grew fainter with each passing season. She hoarded small treasures, smooth pebbles from the fjord, bird feathers, bits of coloured glass, hiding them in places where Torsten would never think to look. These tiny collections were her rebellion, proof that beauty still existed in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. The village itself reflected its Jarl's character. Where once neighbours had gathered freely in each other's homes, now they hurried past with downcast eyes. The traditional evening stories around the central fire had dwindled to uncomfortable silence. Even the children played more quietly than children should, their laughter subdued and careful. It was into this atmosphere of muffled fear that Asgeir the Silent had arrived 2 days before, emerging from the winter forest like something out of an old story. He was easily the largest man anyone in Skarnfjord had ever seen, standing head and shoulders above even the tallest villagers. His hair was the colour of winter storms, streaked with grey that spoke of battles fought and survived. Deep lines marked his face, some from weather, others from burdens that showed in the careful way he carried himself. His clothes were well made but worn, the leather soft with age and use. A great sword hung at his back, its pommel shaped like a wolf's head, the metal dark with years of faithful service. But it was his hands that told the truest story, scarred and weathered, with the calluses of a man who had spent his life holding weapons, yet somehow gentle, when he reached for his pack or accepted the bread offered by wary villagers. Asgeir spoke little, hence the name the villagers had already given him. When he did break his silence, his voice carried the weight of old sorrow and hard-won wisdom. He had approached Torsten with the proper deference due a Jarl, requesting shelter through the harsh months ahead in exchange for whatever service he might provide. His manner suggested a man accustomed to showing respect to authority, though something in his eyes hinted at depths that even a Jarl might not wish to plumb. Torsten had agreed, partly because turning away a warrior of such obvious capability would have been poor politics, and partly because something about the stranger's quiet dignity made him uneasy. Better to keep such a man where he could be watched. A corner of the great hall had been cleared for Asgeir's bedroll, and he had settled in with the practiced efficiency of someone long accustomed to making do with whatever hospitality was offered. But Asgeir's trained eyes missed nothing. Years of warfare had taught him to assess threats and read the subtle signs of conflict, skills that served him well in this new battlefield. He saw how the sisters moved through the hall like ghosts, how their voices never rose above whispers in Torsten's presence, how they instinctively kept distance between themselves and their uncle's reach. He noticed the careful way they served his meals, the downcast eyes, the small flinches when he spoke sharply. Most telling of all, he observed their interactions when they thought themselves unobserved. In those brief moments when Torsten was occupied elsewhere, the sisters' true selves flickered to life like candle flames in a draught. Astrid would gently correct little Sigrid's work with patient hands. The twins would share a moment of silent communication that spoke of unbroken bonds. Ragnhild might offer a tiny smile to Bergljot's whispered question, These glimpses revealed the family they still were beneath the feared daughters, who had not forgotten how to love each other, even if they had forgotten how to hope. Asgeir recognized the signs because he had seen them before, in villages where might made right, and the strong preyed upon the weak. He had spent 30 years of his life in service to kings and lords, fighting battles both glorious and shameful. He had been rewarded with gold and land, with titles that meant nothing to him now. All of it had been left behind the day his king commanded him to burn a village of innocents for the crime of harboring refugees. That was the day Asgeir the Silent had been born, the day he chose exile over compromise, honor over comfort. Since then, he had wandered the northern lands like a ghost of his former self, taking only what work his conscience could bear, seeking something he could not name. Perhaps it was redemption, or perhaps merely peace. He had thought himself beyond caring about the suffering of others, his heart grown cold as the winter mountains. But watching these 6 sisters navigate their daily survival with such quiet courage stirred something in him that he had thought permanently buried. The youngest, Sigrid, particularly drew his attention. She reminded him of his sister's daughter, who would have been about the same age if she had lived. The resemblance was not physical but spiritual, the same bright curiosity carefully hidden, the same need for protection from a world that seemed determined to crush such tender spirits. When he watched her fingers worry those wooden prayer beads, he felt an old, familiar ache, the weight of lives he had failed to save. 2 days of careful observation had confirmed what his instincts told him within the first hour. This was not a household ruled by firm but fair authority. This was a prison where fear kept the doors locked and silence was the only safety. Torsten ruled through intimidation and violence, using his position as Jarl to justify what amounted to tyranny over the most vulnerable members of his own family. The village's complicity in this situation troubled Asgeir almost as much as the abuse itself. These were people who had once known his niece's parents, who had celebrated their births and mourned their parents' deaths. Yet now they hurried past the great hall with carefully averted eyes, unwilling to see what they could not prevent. Fear had made them accomplices to cruelty, their own safety purchased with the silence that allowed suffering to continue. As night settled over Skarnfjord like a familiar cloak, Asgeir lay on his bedroll in the corner of the great hall, listening to the sounds of the household settling into sleep. Torsten's heavy breathing came from the raised platform where the Jarl's bed was situated. Somewhere in the darkness, he could hear the soft whispers of the sisters in their shared sleeping area. Brief exchanges that spoke of comfort given and received, of love persisting in the face of daily hardship. The wooden prayer beads caught a glint of firelight where little Sigrid had dropped them beside her sleeping furs. In that small carved token, Asgeir saw everything that was at stake: innocence fighting to survive, faith holding fast against despair, the unbreakable bonds between sisters who had only each other in a world that had forgotten how to protect them. He thought of the vows he had made long ago, both to kings who had proven unworthy of them and to gods who seemed increasingly distant from the affairs of men. But perhaps there were other vows worth making, other battles worth fighting. Perhaps redemption was not something a man found in solitude, but something he earned through service to those who could not serve themselves. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the great hall. In those shifting patterns of light and darkness, Asgeir began to see the outline of a different future, one where strength served mercy instead of fear, where the powerful protected the vulnerable instead of preying upon them. It would not be an easy path, and the cost might be higher than he could afford to pay. But some fights were worth everything a man had to give. Market day in Skarnfjord brought the village together in a ritual as old as the settlement itself. Despite the winter's grip, traders from nearby settlements braved the cold to exchange goods, news, and gossip. The central square filled with makeshift stalls and the voices of people conducting business, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. It was one of the few times when the village felt truly alive, when neighbors could speak freely while conducting their trade. Astrid led her sisters through the morning preparations with her usual quiet efficiency. They would help with the household's trading, selling preserved fish and furs, purchasing grain and iron goods that would see them through the remaining winter months. Torsten expected them to handle these transactions while he conducted his official business as Jarl, settling disputes and collecting his portion of various trades. Little Sigrid carried the cloth doll that had been her constant companion since their mother's death. The simple toy was made from scraps of blue fabric, stuffed with wool and sewn with careful stitches that spoke of maternal love. Its face had been embroidered with black thread dots for eyes, a curved line for a smiling mouth. The doll was growing threadbare from constant handling, but Sigrid refused to leave it behind, especially on days when they would be in public under Torsten's watchful eye. The sisters arranged their goods with practiced care. Astrid handled the negotiations, while the twins sorted the fish and furs into attractive displays. Ragnhild kept careful count of their inventory, her quick mind tracking what they sold and for how much. Bergliot helped customers examine the goods, her gentle manner often coaxing better prices from buyers who warmed to her shy smile. Sigrid's task was simple, to help carry the heavy bags of grain they would purchase back to the longhouse. She clutched her doll with one arm while trying to manage a sack that was nearly as large as she was. The grain merchant, an elderly man named Olaf, who had known their father, always gave them fair measure and kind words. "Your father would be proud of how well you girls manage," he said quietly to Astrid as he weighed out their purchase. "Times are hard, but you've kept the family together." Astrid accepted the compliment with a small nod, though her eyes remained wary. Such words were dangerous if overheard by the wrong ears. Torsten did not appreciate reminders that his nieces had once belonged to a man more beloved than he would ever be. The trouble began as they prepared to leave Olaf's stall. Sigrid, struggling with the grain sack and trying to keep hold of her doll, stumbled on the uneven ground. The sack tore as she fell, spilling precious grain across the frozen earth like scattered gold. The silence that followed was immediate and terrible, as if the entire market held its breath. Torsten's voice cut across the square like the crack of a whip. "Clumsy girl! Do you know what that grain costs?" He strode toward them with the measured pace of a predator approaching wounded prey. The iron gauntlets were already on his hands. He had been wearing them to emphasize his authority while conducting official business. Now they caught the grey winter light as his fists clenched with barely contained rage. "Uncle, please," Astrid began, stepping protectively in front of her younger sister. "It was an accident." "Silence!" Torsten's gauntleted hand struck her across the face, sending her stumbling backward. The metal left an immediate red mark on her cheek. "I did not ask for your excuses." The market crowd had gone completely quiet now, their conversations dying as they witnessed what was about to unfold. Some looked away, unwilling to see but afraid to intervene. Others watched with the horrible fascination of those who knew they were witnessing something wrong but felt powerless to stop it. Sigrid scrambled on the ground, trying to gather the spilled grain with her small hands while clutching her doll. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered apologies that seemed to fall on deaf ears. "I'm sorry. Uncle, I'm sorry. Please don't be angry." "Sorry." Torsten loomed over the child like a mountain of fury. "Sorry does not replace what you've wasted through your carelessness." His gauntleted hand seized Sigrid by the arm, hauling her to her feet with such force that her doll fell to the ground. The little toy landed in a puddle of half-frozen mud, its blue fabric immediately soaking up the dirty water. "No!" Sigrid cried out, reaching for her doll despite her uncle's painful grip on her arm. "Please, I need—" Torsten's boot came down on the doll with deliberate cruelty. The threads that held it together, weakened by years of loving handling, gave way under his weight. Wool stuffing spilled out like entrails, and the carefully embroidered face disappeared into the mud. "You need to learn responsibility," Torsten snarled, raising his other hand. The iron gauntlet gleamed as it caught the light, and every person in the market knew what was coming. The blow never fell. A massive hand closed around Torsten's wrist with the inexorable strength of a mountain landslide. Asgeir the Silent had moved with a warrior's speed, crossing the distance from where he had been observing the market to where a child was about to be beaten in public. His grip was iron, not the cold, cruel iron of Torsten's gauntlets, but the warm iron of a forge, shaped by purpose and tempered by will. "The child has learned enough for one day," Asgeir said quietly. His voice carried no threat, no anger, only the absolute certainty of a man who would not be moved. Torsten tried to jerk his hand free, but he might as well have tried to pull his arm from a mountain's grip. Rage mottled his face as he realized the humiliation of being stopped so easily, so completely, in front of the entire village. "Release me," Torsten hissed. "You forget yourself, stranger. I am Jarl here." "I forget nothing," Asgeir replied, his eyes meeting Torsten's without fear or deference. "A Jarl protects those under his care. He does not destroy them for the entertainment of his anger." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. No one had spoken to Torsten with such directness in years. The market remained frozen in tableau vendors and customers, watching this confrontation that would reshape everything they understood about power in their village. Slowly, with deliberate care, Asgeir released Torsten's wrist and stepped back. But instead of withdrawing, he did something that sent shockwaves through every witness. The giant warrior dropped to one knee in the muddy square, placing himself at eye level with little Sigrid. "A man's word is his bond," he said, speaking directly to the child, but ensuring his voice carried to every corner of the market. "I give you my word. Young one, no hand raised in anger will touch you or your sisters while I draw breath." The vow was spoken in the old tongue, the formal language of binding oaths that could not be easily broken. It carried weight beyond mere words. It was a promise that demanded honor, that called upon gods and ancestors to witness. Every person present understood they had just heard something sacred, something that would echo through the months and years to come. Sigrid stared at him through her tears. This mountain of a man who had knelt in the mud to speak words of protection to a child. Her small hand crept toward the ruins of her doll, and Asgeir's gaze followed the movement. "Some things that are broken can be mended," he told her gently, gathering the torn fabric and scattered stuffing with careful hands. "With patience and skill, they can be made whole again." Torsten's face had gone white with rage, but he found himself trapped by the very public nature of the scene. To attack a man who had just made such a vow, who knelt unarmed before a child, it would be the act of a coward, and even his authority as Jarl could not shield him from that judgment. "We will discuss this later," Torsten said, his voice thick with suppressed fury. He turned and stalked away from the market, leaving his nieces behind, something he had never done before. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to their business with hushed voices and frequent glances at the spot where everything had changed. Some looked at Asgeir with new respect, others with worry about what his defiance might bring down upon them all. Astrid knelt beside her sister, checking the red marks on Sigrid's arm where Torsten's gauntlets had gripped too tightly. The twins and Bergliot gathered close, their faces showing a mixture of hope and terror at what they had witnessed. "Why?" Ragnhild whispered, speaking directly to Asgeir for the first time. "Why would you risk his anger for us?" Asgeir stood slowly, still holding the pieces of Sigrid's destroyed doll. His eyes held depths of old pain and hard-won wisdom as he looked at each sister in turn. "Because," he said simply, "some things are worth risking everything for, and children who have lost too much already should not lose their faith as well." The market day continued around them, but something fundamental had shifted in Skarnfjord. A line had been drawn in the mud and snow, and everyone present knew that crossing it would lead to consequences none of them could foresee. As the sisters gathered their remaining goods and prepared to return home, they carried with them something they had not possessed in 3 long years, the knowledge that someone was willing to stand between them and harm. It was a fragile gift, as delicate as Sigrid's broken doll, but it was theirs to hold. The walk home from the market felt like a journey through enemy territory. The sisters moved in tight formation, with Astrid leading, and the others clustered around little Sigrid like a living shield. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears about what awaited them at the longhouse. Even the winter wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air understood that something irreversible had been set in motion. Asgeir walked slightly behind them, his presence both comforting and terrifying. The sisters could feel the weight of his protection like a warm cloak, but they also knew it came with a price none of them could yet calculate. In their world, kindness was always followed by punishment, hope by crushing disappointment. Years of survival had taught them that nothing good lasted, that every moment of peace was merely the calm before the next storm. Sigrid clutched the pieces of her doll against her chest, the torn fabric and scattered stuffing, a tangible reminder of what defiance cost. Yet something else nestled in her small hands, a smooth river stone that Asgeir had pressed into her palm as they left the market. It was warm from his touch and carved with a simple rune that meant courage. The stone had belonged to his own sister once, he told her quietly, and it carried the strength of all the brave women who had held it before. "What happens now?" Bergliot whispered, voicing the question that haunted all their minds. "We continue as we always have," Astrid replied, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. The red mark on her cheek, where Torsten's gauntlet had struck her, was already darkening to purple, a visible reminder of their uncle's rage. "We stay quiet, we work hard, and we hope Uncle's anger cools before he kills one of us." Ragnhild finished the thought that Astrid could not speak aloud. The 13-year-old's wisdom had been sharpened by years of carefully observing adult cruelty, and she saw patterns her older sister sometimes missed. The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications, a flicker of eye contact that conveyed volumes. They had been discussing this possibility in whispered conversations for months, what would happen when Torsten's violence finally crossed the line from punishment to something worse. They had seen the way his anger had been growing, fed by drink and the frustrations of a man who ruled through fear but commanded no real respect. "He won't," Astrid said firmly, though whether she was trying to convince her sisters or herself remained unclear. "Uncle may be harsh, but he's not." "Not what?" Solveig interrupted, her voice bitter with accumulated pain. "Not cruel enough to beat an 8-year-old child in public, because we just watched him do exactly that." The longhouse came into view, its familiar outline both sanctuary and prison. Smoke rose from the central fire, indicating that Torsten had already returned and was likely brooding over his humiliation. The sisters paused at the threshold, gathering their courage for whatever awaited them inside. Asgeir stopped beside them, his massive frame blocking some of the wind that cut across the open ground. "Fear is a tool," he said quietly, his words meant for all of them, but his eyes focused on Astrid. "It only has power when you let it make your decisions for you." "Easy words from someone who doesn't have to live with the consequences," Astrid replied, though her tone held no anger, only exhaustion that seemed far too deep for someone so young. "All men live with consequences," Asgeir responded. "The only choice is whether those consequences come from action or inaction. I have spent years learning the difference." Inside the longhouse, Torsten sat in his great chair like a king holding court over an empty kingdom. The iron gauntlets lay on a table beside him, their metal surface reflecting the firelight in menacing patterns. His face was flushed with drink and suppressed rage, and his eyes tracked their movements with predatory attention. "So," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "my nieces return at last. I trust you completed the trading despite the morning's unfortunate incident." The sisters moved carefully toward their usual places, but Torsten's next words froze them in place. "Not you," he said, pointing directly at Sigrid. "You cost me grain and embarrassed me before the entire village. You will go to bed without supper and spend tomorrow working in the storage shed to understand the value of what you wasted." The storage shed was a punishment that bordered on cruelty. In winter, it was barely warmer than the outdoors, and a full day of work there would leave a grown man exhausted and chilled. For an 8-year-old child, it was potentially dangerous. "Uncle, please," Astrid began, but Torsten's raised hand silenced her. "The stranger's interference changes nothing," Torsten continued, his voice gaining heat. "This is my house, and these are my family. No amount of dramatic posturing will alter that fact." Sigrid's lower lip trembled, but she nodded obediently. 3 years of training had taught her that arguing only made things worse. She clutched her river stone tightly, drawing what comfort she could from its warm surface and the promise it represented. "Actually," Asgeir said from the doorway, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "I believe there has been some misunderstanding." Torsten's face went rigid with fury. "This is a private family matter, stranger. You have no place here." "A man who gives his word in public makes it everyone's business," Asgeir replied, stepping fully into the hall. His presence seemed to fill the space, making even the large room feel smaller. "I spoke an oath today, witnessed by gods and men. Such words have weight." "Your oath means nothing to me," Torsten snarled, rising from his chair. "I am Jarl here, and I will discipline my family as I see fit." "Then you misunderstand the nature of the oath I made," Asgeir said calmly. He moved further into the room, positioning himself where he could see all the sisters while keeping Torsten in sight. "I did not promise to protect them only when it was convenient or politically wise. I promised to protect them while I draw breath. That breath continues." The confrontation hung in the air like smoke from green wood, thick, choking, and impossible to ignore. The sisters pressed themselves against the far wall, their eyes wide as they watched these two men circle each other with words that cut deeper than any blade. Torsten's hand moved toward his gauntlets, then stopped. The memory of Asgeir's iron grip from the market was still fresh, and even through his rage, he retained enough sense to recognize a battle he could not win through strength alone. "Fine," Torsten said, forcing his voice into something resembling calm. "The child may eat tonight, but this changes nothing long-term, stranger. Winter will end, and you will move on. When that happens, these girls will still be here, still under my authority." "Perhaps," Asgeir acknowledged. "But until that day comes, my word stands." The temporary peace felt fragile as spider silk, likely to tear at the slightest provocation, yet for the moment it held. Sigrid would eat tonight, would sleep in her familiar bed instead of shivering in the storage shed. It was a small victory, but in a life measured by such margins, even small victories mattered. As the evening settled into an uneasy routine, the sisters helped prepare the meal with heightened awareness of every sound, every gesture. They had witnessed something unprecedented, their uncle challenged and forced to back down. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. Change had come to the longhouse of Jarl Torsten, carried in the massive hands of a warrior who knelt in mud to make promises to children. Whether that change would bring salvation or greater suffering remained to be seen, but one truth had become crystal clear. Their old life of silent endurance had ended forever. 3 days passed in the longhouse, like the careful steps of dancers avoiding a pit trap. The sisters moved through their daily routines with heightened awareness, reading every shift in Torsten's mood, every glance from Asgeir, every creak of the wooden beams above their heads. The tension stretched between the two men like a bowstring drawn to its limit, and everyone in the household knew that something would have to give way soon. Asgeir had taken to spending his mornings in the village, offering his skills to anyone who needed them. Word had spread quickly about his expertise. He could repair damaged weapons with the skill of a master smith. His knowledge of construction was deep and practical, and his strength made light work of tasks that normally required multiple men. The villagers began to approach him cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized he asked for nothing beyond fair payment and treated everyone with quiet respect. More importantly, his presence in the village meant that eyes other than the sisters witnessed his character. Old Eric the blacksmith praised his metalwork. Widow Magna spoke of how he had repaired her roof without being asked. Even the children, initially frightened by his size, had begun following him around like curious puppies after he carved small wooden toys for them during his breaks. These small acts were deliberate, as Asgeir understood that his protection of the sisters would only be sustainable if the village came to see him as more than just a dangerous stranger. He needed them to understand that his strength served justice, not chaos, that his presence made their community safer, not more dangerous. In the evenings, when the household gathered around the central fire, a new dynamic had emerged. Asgeir would work quietly on small projects, while the sisters went about their tasks. He was repairing Sigrid's doll with careful stitches, using thread he had purchased with his own earnings, and stuffing it with fresh wool. The work was painstaking. His large fingers were not naturally suited to such delicate tasks, but he persevered with the same patient determination he brought to everything else. The sisters watched this unlikely sight with fascination. None of them had ever seen a warrior of Asgeir's reputation doing needlework, yet he approached the task without embarrassment or self-consciousness. When Bergliot shyly offered to help with the more detailed stitching, he accepted her assistance with genuine gratitude. "My sister taught me to sew," he explained quietly as they worked together. "She said a man who could mend cloth could mend many things, including himself, when the need arose." These conversations were dangerous territory. Torsten disapproved of the familiarity growing between his guest and his nieces, but he could find no reasonable objection to a man repairing a child's damaged toy. Still, his displeasure was evident in the way his jaw tightened whenever he heard their quiet voices sharing stories or gentle laughter. The breaking point came on the fourth evening, when Ragnhild made a mistake that in other times would have been considered minor. She was helping to serve the evening meal when she accidentally knocked over Torsten's drinking horn, spilling ale across the wooden table and onto his clothes. The hall went silent, except for the drip of spilled liquid hitting the floor. Torsten's face darkened with the kind of rage that preceded violence, and his hand moved instinctively toward the iron gauntlets that hung nearby. "Clumsy fool," he snarled, rising from his chair with deliberate menace. "Do you think ale grows on trees? Do you think clean clothes appear by magic?" Ragnhild froze like a deer caught in a hunter's sight, her eyes wide with terror. She had seen this sequence too many times before: the verbal assault followed by physical punishment, the pain that would linger for days afterward. Her sisters tensed around the edges of the hall, wanting to help, but knowing that interference would only make things worse. "I'm sorry, Uncle," she whispered, backing away slowly. "It was an accident. I'll clean it up right away." "Sorry?" Torsten's voice rose to a roar. "Sorry doesn't replace what you've wasted or clean what you've soiled." He lunged for the gauntlets, but his hand closed on empty air. Asgeir stood beside the wall where the gauntlets had hung, the metal gloves now resting in his massive palms like captured birds. "These seem to cause nothing but trouble," Asgeir observed mildly, examining the ornate ironwork with professional interest. "Perhaps they would be safer elsewhere until tempers cool." The casual theft of his symbols of authority sent Torsten into a fury that bordered on madness. "Give those back immediately. You overstep yourself, stranger. This is my house, my family, my right. Rights must be earned through wisdom, not claimed through violence." Asgeir replied, his voice still calm but carrying new steel. "A true Jarl protects those under his care. He does not terrorize children over spilled ale." "I am Jarl here," Torsten screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I decide what is justice and what is mercy, not some wandering exile who sells his sword for bread and shelter." The word exile hung in the air like a blade thrust between them. Torsten had done his research, asked careful questions of traveling merchants and visiting warriors. He knew more about Asgeir's past than he had initially revealed, and now he used that knowledge like a weapon. "Yes," Asgeir said simply, showing no shame or anger at the revelation. "I am exile. I chose honor over obedience, conscience over convenience. Some might consider that a failing, others might call it wisdom." He set the gauntlets down on the table between them, but positioned where Torsten would have to reach across Asgeir's body to retrieve them. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. "You lecture me about honor while you interfere with my family," Torsten demanded, though he made no move toward the gauntlets. "You know nothing about the burden of responsibility, the weight of making hard choices." "I know about making choices that keep you awake at night," Asgeir replied quietly. "I know about the difference between strength that protects and strength that destroys, and I know that a man who beats children has confused power with authority." The words hit Torsten like physical blows. Around the edges of the hall, the sisters watched this confrontation with a mixture of terror and hope. They had never heard anyone speak to their uncle this way, never seen him challenged so directly or forced to justify his actions. Torsten's hand trembled as he reached for his drinking horn, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. But the horn was empty, its contents still dripping from the table edge, where Ragnhild's accident had started this entire confrontation. "Clean this mess," he ordered, his voice thick with frustrated rage. "All of you. And in the future, mind your clumsiness more carefully." It was a retreat disguised as authority, and everyone in the room recognized it as such. Torsten had been forced to back down again, his power diminished by his inability to reclaim his gauntlets or follow through on his threats of violence. As the sisters hurried to clean the spilled ale, they moved with a new awareness. The dynamic in their household was shifting, power flowing away from fear and toward something they had almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. That night, as the fire burned low and the household settled into sleep, Asgeir sat in his corner, working on Sigrid's doll by the fading light. The blue fabric was taking shape again, the careful stitches binding torn pieces into wholeness. It was slow work, requiring patience and skill, but the result would be stronger than the original, reinforced at the points where it had once been broken. Perhaps, he thought, that was true of more than just dolls. Perhaps everything that had been damaged could be made whole again, given enough time and the right kind of care. The sisters were watching him work, their eyes bright with curiosity and something that might have been trust. Change was coming to the longhouse of Jarl Torsten, one careful stitch at a time. The old leather journal had belonged to Asgeir's mentor, a grizzled warrior named Magnus, who had taught him that battles were won in the mind long before steel met steel. Its pages were filled with observations about leadership, notes on reading men's characters, and hard-won wisdom about when to fight and when to find another path. Asgeir had carried it through 30 years of campaigns, adding his own thoughts to Magnus's teachings, and now it helped him understand the complex war being waged within the walls of Torsten's longhouse. A week had passed since the incident with the spilled ale, and the atmosphere in the household had grown thick as winter fog. Torsten's behavior had become unpredictable, sometimes retreating into sullen silence, other times exploding into rage over trivial matters. The sisters walked on knife's edge, never knowing which version of their uncle they would encounter from one moment to the next. Asgeir used the quiet hours before dawn to write in his journal, documenting patterns he observed and strategies he might employ. Torsten was not merely cruel, he was systematically breaking down the sisters' spirits through psychological warfare as sophisticated as any military campaign. The man understood that physical violence left marks that others might question, but emotional cruelty left wounds that healed inwardly, invisible to outside eyes. The journal's leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and its pages held sketches alongside the written observations. Asgeir had drawn the layout of the longhouse, marking positions and escape routes. He had noted the timing of village activities, when help might be available and when they would be truly alone. Most importantly, he had begun documenting each sister's individual strengths and vulnerabilities, understanding that protecting them would require knowing them as completely as he knew his own weapons. Astrid emerged as a natural leader whose protective instincts sometimes clouded her judgment. She would sacrifice herself without hesitation to spare her sister's pain, a nobility that Torsten exploited mercilessly. The twins had developed an almost telepathic communication that allowed them to coordinate responses to danger, but their dependence on each other could become a weakness if they were separated. Ragnhild possessed a sharp intelligence that she kept carefully hidden, while Bergliot's gentle nature made her particularly susceptible to emotional manipulation. And then there was Sigrid, the youngest, whose resilience astounded him daily. Despite everything she had endured, she still carried that stone he had given her like a talisman, still found reasons to smile when she thought no one was watching. She reminded him painfully of his sister's daughter, the child he had failed to protect during that long-ago village burning. Perhaps redemption lay not in undoing past failures, but in preventing future ones. The journal also contained more troubling observations. Torsten had begun making inquiries about Asgeir's past, sending messages to contacts in neighboring settlements. The man was gathering information systematically, looking for leverage or weakness he could exploit. Asgeir had expected this. Any competent leader would research a potential threat, but it accelerated the timeline for action. More concerning were the signs that Torsten's control over the village itself was beginning to fray. Several families had approached Asgeir privately, expressing concerns about their Jarl's increasingly erratic behavior. They spoke in whispers about missed judgments, unfair punishments, and a growing sense that their leader served his own anger rather than his people's welfare. Old Henrik the fisherman had been most direct. Things were different when the girl's father was alive, he said, while Asgeir helped repair his nets. Bjorn was a fair man, wise in his judgments. This one, he gestured toward the longhouse with obvious distaste. This one rules through fear. It's no way to lead good people. These conversations revealed the deeper truth about Torsten's position. He was not loved or respected, he was merely tolerated, because removing a sitting Jarl required either clear evidence of unfitness or the support of a strong alternative. Asgeir represented both possibilities, though he had not yet declared any intention to challenge Torsten's authority directly. The political implications weighed heavily on his mind as he wrote in his journal by the pre-dawn firelight. A direct confrontation might succeed in protecting the sisters, but it could also plunge the entire village into chaos. Yet continuing the present course would surely result in escalating violence against the children he had sworn to protect. His contemplation was interrupted by soft footsteps. Astrid approached the fire, moving with the careful silence of someone accustomed to avoiding unwanted attention. She had been waking early more frequently, driven by nightmares and the constant stress of trying to shield her sisters from harm. "You write much for a warrior," she observed quietly, settling beside the fire at a respectful distance. "Words can be as powerful as swords," Asgeir replied, closing the journal but not hiding it. "Sometimes more so, because they endure long after the battle ends." "What do you write about us?" The question carried no accusation, only weary curiosity. "I write about strength I see in unexpected places," he answered honestly. "About courage that persists despite fear, love that survives in harsh conditions. About young women who have kept their family together against impossible odds." Astrid's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "We're not strong. We're just surviving. Sometimes survival is the highest form of strength," Asgeir said gently. "You have protected your sisters' lives, their bonds with each other, their capacity for hope. That is no small victory. For how long?" The words burst out of her like water through a cracked dam. He grows worse each day. His anger feeds on itself, and we give him new reasons to be furious simply by existing. Yesterday he struck Bergliot for humming while she worked humming. What will it be tomorrow? What happens when your presence here is no longer enough to hold him back? The questions hung between them like drawn blades. Asgeir had been wrestling with the same concerns, knowing that his protection could only delay the inevitable confrontation, not prevent it entirely. Your uncle seeks to break your spirits because he knows he cannot break your bonds, Asgeir said carefully. He understands that your love for each other is stronger than his authority. That knowledge terrifies him. Then why doesn't he just... Astrid stopped herself, unwilling to voice the thought that haunted her darkest moments. Because deep down, he knows that harming you directly would destroy any claim to legitimacy he still possesses. Asgeir finished. The village tolerates his harsh rule because they believe he acts from duty, not cruelty. If that illusion crumbles, he loses everything. Astrid absorbed this insight with the careful attention of someone learning to see her prison from new angles. "You think like a leader," she said finally. "I think like a soldier who has served under many leaders," Asgeir corrected. "I have learned to recognize the difference between strength and weakness, between true authority and borrowed power." The conversation was interrupted by sounds from the sleeping area where Torsten rested. Heavy footsteps and muttered curses indicated that the Jarl was awake and already in poor temper. Astrid tensed immediately, her brief moment of openness closing like a fortress gate. "Remember what I told you about fear," Asgeir said softly as she prepared to leave. "It is a tool that only works when you allow it to make your choices. You are stronger than you know, and you are not alone." As dawn broke over Skarnfjord, painting the longhouse walls with pale winter light, Asgeir returned his journal to its hidden place among his belongings. The leather was warm from the fire and smooth from years of use, a repository of wisdom earned through experience and sacrifice. The day ahead would bring new challenges, new tests of will and wisdom, but it would also bring opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. Change was coming to the village whether they guided it or not. The only question was whether that change would bring liberation or destruction. The amber amulet had been carved from a piece of fossilized tree resin that contained the perfect silhouette of an ancient leaf, preserved for countless generations like a memory trapped in golden stone. It hung from a simple leather cord around Astrid's neck, hidden beneath her woolen dress, a gift from their mother on her 16th birthday, meant to be worn on her wedding day. Now it served as her secret source of strength, a tangible connection to happier times when love had filled their household instead of fear. 2 weeks into what the villagers were quietly calling the long winter, tensions in the longhouse had reached a breaking point that stretched beyond simple domestic discord. Torsten had begun drinking earlier each day, his consumption of ale increasing as his control over his household visibly eroded. The iron gauntlets remained on the table where Asgeir had placed them, untouched but omnipresent symbols of authority that their owner could no longer claim without acknowledging his challenger's power to grant or withhold them. The sisters had noticed changes in themselves that were both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in 3 years, they had begun speaking in normal voices instead of whispers. Bergliot had started humming again while she worked, her clear voice carrying simple melodies that filled the longhouse with something resembling joy. The twins had rediscovered their ability to laugh together, their shared mirth no longer immediately suppressed by fear of consequences. Most remarkably, Ragnhild had begun asking questions, not the careful, practical queries that focused on daily survival, but genuine curiosity about the world beyond Skarnfjord's borders. She approached Asgeir during his evening work sessions, seeking stories about distant lands and different customs, her clever mind absorbing information with the hunger of someone long denied intellectual nourishment. "Is it true that in the southern kingdoms women can own property in their own names?" she asked one evening as she helped him organize his tools. In some places, yes, Asgeir replied, noting how carefully she phrased her question. There are lands where a woman's worth is measured by her wisdom, rather than her willingness to submit to male authority. These conversations were dangerous, and everyone present knew it. Torsten's face darkened whenever he overheard such discussions, recognizing them for what they truly were, seeds of rebellion being planted in carefully prepared soil. Yet he could find no reasonable objection to educational discourse, and any attempt to forbid it would only highlight his fear of independent thought among his nieces. The amber amulet had become Astrid's anchor during these shifting currents of change. When Torsten's rage erupted without warning, when the familiar patterns of fear threatened to overwhelm her newfound courage, she would touch the hidden pendant and remember her mother's words, "Strength flows like water, child. It finds its way around obstacles, wearing them down slowly but surely." That wisdom proved prescient when the first real test of their changing dynamic arrived in the form of Sven Iron Arm, a Jarl from a neighboring settlement who had come to discuss territorial boundaries and trade agreements. Sven was known for his harsh methods and his belief that women should remain silent unless directly addressed. His visit represented both an opportunity and a danger, a chance for Torsten to reassert his authority, but also a risk that outside eyes might witness the true state of his household. The sisters prepared for the visit with the careful attention they once reserved for avoiding punishment. They understood that their behavior during Sven's stay could determine whether their uncle's growing instability became public knowledge or remained a private shame. Astrid touched her amber amulet repeatedly as she organized the cleaning and cooking, drawing strength from its warm surface and the memory of her mother's steady presence. Sven arrived with his usual bluster and immediately began testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. He made crude comments about the sisters' appearances, suggested that Torsten was too soft in his handling of female relatives, and generally behaved like a man accustomed to having his worst impulses indulged rather than challenged. "You keep a quiet household," Sven observed during the evening meal, his eyes lingering on each sister in turn with obvious calculation. "Perhaps too quiet. Young women should have more spirit. It makes them more entertaining." The comment was deliberately provocative, designed to gauge how much control Torsten actually exercised over his family. In the past, such remarks might have prompted Torsten to demonstrate his authority through some display of dominance over his nieces. Now, with Asgeir's presence serving as a silent constraint, he found himself trapped between conflicting pressures. "My nieces understand their place," Torsten replied carefully, though his knuckles were white where he gripped his drinking horn. "Do they?" Sven's smile was predatory. "Perhaps they need reminding. In my hall, women who grow too comfortable with themselves find their attitudes quickly corrected." The threat was unmistakable, and Astrid felt her hand move instinctively toward the amber amulet. Around the table, her sisters tensed, like deer scenting wolves, their newly discovered confidence wavering under the weight of familiar intimidation. But before anyone else could respond, Asgeir's voice cut through the tension with quiet authority. "Wise men judge a household by the contentment of its members, not their fear," he said, his tone conversational but his eyes hard as winter steel. "A Jarl who rules through love commands loyalty that no amount of force can purchase." Sven turned his attention to Asgeir with obvious irritation. "And you are?" "A guest who has observed the wisdom of this household's management," Asgeir replied smoothly. "The sisters work with dedication because they are valued, not because they are threatened. It is a lesson worth learning." The exchange carried multiple layers of meaning that both Jarls understood perfectly. Sven was being warned that his casual cruelty would not be tolerated, while Torsten was being offered a face-saving interpretation of his recent restraint. Most importantly, the sisters were being shown that their protector's commitment extended even to situations involving powerful visitors. Sven's eyes narrowed as he assessed this unexpected challenge. You speak boldly for a man eating another's bread. I speak truthfully, which requires more courage than boldness, Asgeir replied. Truth has a way of enduring long after comfort ends. The remainder of the evening passed in careful conversation that danced around the real issues at stake. Sven probed for weaknesses, while Asgeir deflected with philosophical observations that carried subtle warnings. Torsten sat between them like a man watching his own judgment unfold, knowing that his response to this situation would define his future relationship with both the visitor and his own household. When Sven finally departed the next morning, he left behind an atmosphere of unresolved tension that everyone understood would eventually demand resolution. His parting words to Torsten carried an unmistakable challenge. I hope your guest's influence proves beneficial to your leadership. Some changes strengthen a man's position, while others reveal weaknesses that enemies find useful. After the visitor's departure, Astrid found herself alone with Asgeir in the early afternoon quiet. She pulled the amber amulet from beneath her dress, letting it catch the pale light filtering through the small windows. My mother said this would protect me, she said softly, holding the pendant so he could see the perfect leaf preserved within. I think she meant it would remind me who I was meant to be, not just who I had been forced to become. Asgeir studied the ancient artifact with the respect it deserved. Some protection comes from within, he agreed. Your mother gave you more than jewelry. She gave you the knowledge that you carry strength in your blood. As winter deepened around Skarnfjord, the amber amulet became a symbol of transformation occurring within the longhouse walls. Like the leaf preserved in golden resin, the sisters' true selves were emerging from the protective shell that fear had built around them. The question now was whether that emergence would survive the trials that were yet to come. The old copper seal bore the mark of King Harald himself, a wolf's head surrounded by runic inscriptions that spelled out royal authority in letters that commanded respect from all who could read their meaning. The document it authenticated had arrived with the dawn messenger, carried through winter storms and frozen fjords to reach the remote village of Skarnfjord. What it contained would change everything the sisters thought they knew about their past, their uncle's motives, and their own future. Torsten received the royal messenger in his great chair. The iron gauntlets finally returned to his hands for this formal occasion. The young courier was frostbitten and exhausted from his journey, but his message carried the weight of royal command that could not be delayed by weather or convenience. Jarl Torsten of Skarnfjord, the messenger announced in the formal tone required for royal communications. His Majesty King Harald requires your presence at court to answer questions regarding the inheritance claims of your late brother Bjorn's daughters. The words fell into the longhouse like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward into every corner of the hall. The sisters, who had been quietly attending to their morning tasks, froze in place as the implications began to dawn on them. Asgeir, sharpening his blade by the fire, went completely still, his warrior instincts recognizing the moment when a battlefield shifted beneath everyone's feet. Inheritance claims? Torsten's voice carried a dangerous edge. What inheritance claims? My brother left nothing but debts, and these girls to burden his family. The messenger consulted his scroll with the careful attention of someone who knew his life might depend on delivering his message exactly as written. The claims filed with the royal court indicate that Bjorn of Skarnfjord owned significant property both within and beyond the village boundaries. Additionally, questions have been raised regarding the administration of his daughter's dowries and marriage portions. Impossible, Torsten snarled, though something in his eyes suggested this news was not entirely unexpected. My brother was a poor man who left nothing of value. But Astrid had gone pale as winter snow, her hand moving instinctively to the amber amulet hidden beneath her dress. Fragments of half-remembered conversations between her parents began forming new patterns in her mind, whispered discussions about the safe place, about provisions for the girl's future, about arrangements that would ensure their security even if the worst should happen. The messenger continued with professional determination. His Majesty expects your presence within 1 month's time. You are also commanded to bring with you all documents relating to your stewardship of the estate and the welfare of your nieces. When the messenger had been fed, warmed, and sent on his way to his next destination, the longhouse erupted into the kind of chaos that had been building for weeks. Torsten paced like a caged animal, his fury now mixed with something that looked remarkably like panic. The iron gauntlets clanked against each other as he gestured wildly, and his usual calculated cruelty had been replaced by the desperate anger of a man whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to crumble. "Royal meddling," he spat, though his words lacked conviction. "Some fool has been spreading tales to curry favor at court. When I find out who—" "Uncle," Astrid interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "What inheritance, what property did our father really leave?" The question hung in the air like an unsheathed blade. Torsten's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that spoke of barely controlled rage mixed with fear. "Your father left nothing but trouble," he replied, but the words rang false even to his own ears. "Everything you have, every bite of food, every piece of clothing, comes from my generosity. Do not forget that." But the copper seal had already done its work, breaking open a carefully maintained deception that had shaped 3 years of their lives. The sisters began remembering things, their father's private meetings with visiting merchants, their mother's references to the land up north, the way their parents had spoken about the future with confidence rather than worry. Asgeir rose from his position by the fire with deliberate care, his journal tucked securely in his belt. The revelation explained many things that had puzzled him about Torsten's behavior, the excessive control over the sisters, the desperate need to break their spirits, the panic that followed any challenge to his authority. "Perhaps," Asgeir said quietly, "this is an opportunity to ensure that everyone receives what rightfully belongs to them." Torsten whirled on him with venomous fury. This has your stench on it, doesn't it? You've been corresponding with the court, poisoning them against me with your lies." "I have written no letters to any court," Asgeir replied truthfully, "but I suspect someone else has someone who knew the truth about what Bjorn left behind and decided that justice had been delayed long enough." The implication sent another shock through the room. Someone in the village had betrayed Torsten's secret, had taken the enormous risk of bringing royal attention to their remote settlement. But who possessed both the knowledge and the courage to take such action? The answer came from an unexpected source. Bergliot, the gentle sister who rarely spoke above a whisper, stepped forward with trembling hands but clear eyes. "I wrote to the court," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. 3 months ago, when old Magnus was making his trading journey south, I gave him a letter to carry to anyone who served the king. The confession struck the room like a lightning bolt. Even Asgeir, who had been watching for signs of rebellion among the sisters, had not suspected that the quietest among them was capable of such decisive action. "You," Torsten's voice rose to a roar, "you treacherous little snake, how dare you?" "I dared because someone had to," Bergliot continued, though tears streamed down her face. "I remembered the things Father used to say about the land he bought for our dowries. I remembered Mother talking about the money set aside for our futures. When you told us there was nothing, I knew you were lying." The courage required for this confession was staggering. For 3 months, Bergliot had carried the weight of her secret action, never knowing if help would come or if her letter would disappear into the vast bureaucracy of royal administration. She had watched her sisters suffer under Torsten's increasingly brutal rule, while hoping that somewhere, someone was listening to the plea of a desperate child. "The documents," Astrid said suddenly, her mind racing through new understanding. "Father's documents about the property. Where are they, Uncle?" Torsten's silence was answer enough. The papers existed, hidden somewhere in the longhouse, proof of wealth that he had claimed for himself, while telling his nieces they were paupers dependent on his charity. "The strong box," Ragnhild breathed, her quick intelligence piecing together clues they had all seen but never understood. "The one you keep locked in your sleeping chamber. That's where you've hidden everything that belonged to our father." The copper seal caught the firelight as it lay on the table where the messenger had left it, its royal authority gleaming like a promise of justice long delayed. Around that simple piece of metal, the carefully constructed lies of 3 years were collapsing like a house built on sand. Asgeir watched the unfolding revelation with the tactical awareness of a veteran warrior. Torsten was trapped between multiple threats: royal investigation, village exposure, and the growing boldness of the nieces he had worked so hard to break. Like any cornered animal, he would be most dangerous now, when his usual tools of intimidation and manipulation had lost their power. "This changes everything," Asgeir said quietly, speaking to the sisters but ensuring Torsten heard every word. "You are not dependents begging for charity. You are heirs to property that belongs to you by right of birth." The transformation was immediate and visible. Astrid stood straighter, her hand moving to the amber amulet with new understanding of what it represented. The twins exchanged glances that spoke of shared revelation rather than shared fear. Ragnhild's eyes blazed with intelligence, no longer forced into hiding. Even little Sigrid seemed to grasp that something fundamental had shifted in their favor. But Torsten was not finished. Desperation had made him dangerous in new ways, and the iron gauntlets were back in his possession. The royal summons gave him 1 month to prepare his defense, 1 month to find ways to discredit his accusers or eliminate the evidence of his theft. As the pale winter sun tracked across the sky above Skarnfjord, the copper seal continued to gleam on the wooden table, a small piece of metal that had shattered years of carefully maintained deception. The sisters were no longer helpless orphans, dependent on their uncle's reluctant charity. They were victims of theft, witnesses to fraud, and heirs to property that could secure their independence. The question now was whether they would live long enough to claim what was rightfully theirs. The ancient war horn had been carved from the tusk of a massive walrus, its surface etched with runes that told the story of Skarnfjord's founding generations ago. It hung in the place of honor above Torsten's great chair, silent for years but still capable of summoning every able-bodied villager when the need arose. No one had expected to hear its deep, mournful call on a winter morning, 3 weeks after the royal messenger's visit, but its voice now echoed across the settlement like the cry of some awakening giant. Asgeir was the first to reach the longhouse, his warrior instincts responding to the emergency signal before his conscious mind fully processed what he was hearing. What he found inside chilled him more than any winter storm. The hall was empty, except for overturned furniture and signs of hasty departure. The iron gauntlets lay abandoned on the floor, and Torsten's travelling pack was conspicuously absent from its usual place. "They're gone," old Henrik gasped as he arrived with several other villagers. All of them the Jarl and the girls. Someone saw them leaving before dawn, heading toward the high mountain passes. The implication struck Asgeir like a physical blow. Torsten had chosen to run rather than face royal judgment, and he had taken the sisters with him, either as hostages to ensure safe passage or to dispose of them permanently in the wilderness where their bodies would never be found. Either possibility demanded immediate action, but the mountain paths in winter were treacherous even for experienced travelers with proper equipment. "How long?" Asgeir demanded, already moving toward his weapons and supplies. 3 hours, maybe 4, replied Widow Magna, who had been among the first to notice the unusual silence from the longhouse, long enough to reach the first ridge if they pushed hard. Asgeir's mind raced through tactical calculations, honed by decades of military experience. Torsten had chosen the mountain route because it was difficult to follow, but also because it was dangerous for anyone unfamiliar with winter survival. The sisters would slow his progress. They lacked proper clothing for high-altitude travel, and their smaller frames would struggle with the physical demands of climbing through deep snow. But there was more at stake than simple pursuit. The Warhorn's call had been deliberate, meant to gather witnesses to whatever story Torsten intended to tell about his niece's fate. He was creating an alibi, positioning himself as a grieving uncle whose charges had tragically perished during an attempt to flee their lawful guardian. "He's planning to return alone," Asgeir said grimly, the pattern becoming clear in his mind. "He'll claim the girls panicked about the royal summons and tried to escape to avoid questioning. When their bodies are found in spring, it will appear they died from exposure while fleeing justice." The villagers absorbed this assessment with growing horror. Several of the women began weeping openly, while the men exchanged glances that spoke of shame and regret. They had all known something was wrong in Torsten's household, but fear and social convention had kept them from acting until it was almost too late. "We have to go after them," Henrik declared, though his old bones were clearly unsuited for mountain travel in winter conditions. "No," Asgeir said firmly, his tactical mind already formulating a plan. "A large group will move too slowly and leave too obvious a trail. This requires speed and stealth, not numbers." He gathered his gear with practiced efficiency: winter clothing, rope, climbing tools, emergency food, and weapons suited for both combat and survival. The pursuit would demand everything he had learned about mountain warfare during his years of military service, combined with intimate knowledge of how desperate men behaved when cornered. As he prepared to leave, Widow Magna approached with something wrapped in oiled cloth. "This belonged to your mentor, Magnus," she said quietly. "He left it with me before his last journey, said it might help someone who needed to find their way in dark places." Inside the wrapping was a compass of exquisite craftsmanship, its brass surface engraved with symbols that seemed to catch and hold light even in the dim interior of the longhouse. More than a navigation tool, it represented the wisdom of an old warrior who had understood that finding one's way required more than simple direction. It demanded clarity of purpose and unwavering determination. "Magnus always said the hardest journeys begin when you think you're already lost," Widow Magna continued. "He would want you to have this." Asgeir accepted the compass with reverence, due both to the gift and the giver. Magnus had been more than a mentor. He had been the father figure who taught Asgeir that true strength served justice rather than personal ambition. Having his compass for this rescue felt like carrying the old warrior's blessing into battle. The trail was easy to follow at first. Torsten had made no effort to conceal their passage, confident that winter conditions and terrain would discourage pursuit. Boot prints in the snow told a story that made Asgeir's jaw clench with suppressed fury. The sisters were struggling, their smaller footprints showing frequent stumbles and signs of exhaustion. Torsten was pushing them beyond their physical limits, driving them toward collapse through deliberate cruelty. As he climbed higher into the mountains, following a path that grew increasingly treacherous with each step, Asgeir found himself remembering the journal entries he had written about each sister's individual strengths. Astrid's protective determination would keep her moving despite pain, but it might also lead her to exhaust herself, shielding her younger sisters from the worst hardships. The twins would support each other, but their interdependence could become a liability if one of them faltered. Ragnhild's quick intelligence would help her conserve energy and find opportunities for resistance, while Bergliot's gentle nature might make her vulnerable to despair. Little Sigrid worried him most. Her small body was least suited for this ordeal, but her surprising reservoir of courage might sustain her longer than expected. The compass guided him true as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Magnus had always emphasized that successful pursuit required thinking like both hunter and prey, understanding not just where the quarry was going, but why they had chosen that particular path. Torsten was heading for the old trading route that connected Skarnfjord to settlements in the next valley, a path that would be completely impassable by spring, but might still allow winter passage for someone desperate enough to risk everything. 3 hours into the pursuit, Asgeir found the first sign of serious trouble. Blood in the snow, dark droplets that spoke of injury or exhaustion pushed beyond safe limits. The trail showed increasing signs of struggle areas where someone had fallen and been dragged back to their feet, footprints that wandered off the path before being forcibly corrected. Worse, the weather was deteriorating. Clouds were gathering around the high peaks, and the wind carried the sharp edge that preceded serious snowfall. If a storm struck while they were exposed on the upper slopes, survival would become questionable even for someone with proper equipment and experience. Asgeir increased his pace, pushing his own endurance to match the urgency of the situation. The compass remained steady in his hand, its needle pointing toward magnetic north, while his instincts pointed toward justice. Every step carried him further from safety and deeper into conditions that could kill the unprepared. But he had made a vow in the mud of Skarnfjord's market square, and that promise demanded fulfillment, regardless of personal cost. As daylight began to fade and the first snow flurries started to swirl around the rocky outcroppings, he finally heard what he had been straining to detect: voices carried on the wind, too distant to make out words, but close enough to confirm that his quarry was still moving. The sisters were still alive, still enduring whatever torment Torsten inflicted on them as they climbed toward what he intended to be their final destination. The compass gleamed in the last light of the winter afternoon, its brass surface reflecting his determination back at him like a mirror. Magnus had always said that the most important journeys were those undertaken not for glory or gain, but for the simple reason that someone had to take them. Tonight, in the frozen heights above Skarnfjord, that someone was Asgeir the Silent, a man who had spent years seeking redemption and had finally found it in the promise to protect 6 sisters from the cruelty of those who should have loved them. The final confrontation was approaching with the inevitability of nightfall, and when it came, it would determine not just the fate of the sisters, but the very nature of justice, in a world where the strong too often preyed upon the weak. The compass pointed north, toward the difficult path ahead, but Asgeir's heart pointed toward something more precious than any direction: the chance to prove that honor could still triumph over brutality, that protection could overcome oppression, that some vows were worth keeping, even unto death. The mountain winds howled around him as he pressed forward into the gathering darkness, following a trail that led toward either salvation or catastrophe, guided by an ancient compass and an unbreakable promise made in the sight of gods and men. The wolf's head pommel on Asgeir's sword caught the last rays of sunlight as he crested the rocky ridge, its carved features seeming to snarl at the scene spread out below him in the narrow valley. There, huddled around a pitiful fire that gave more smoke than warmth, were the 6 sisters he had sworn to protect. They sat in a tight circle, their thin clothing woefully inadequate for the mountain cold, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Torsten paced around them like a predator circling wounded prey, his own winter gear marking the cruel disparity between his preparation and theirs. He had planned this journey carefully, ensuring his own survival while deliberately exposing his nieces to conditions that would justify their deaths as tragic accidents. "Uncle, please," Astrid's voice carried across the cold air, hoarse from hours of pleading. "Sigrid can't go any further. She needs rest, needs warmth. What she needs is to learn the consequences of betrayal," Torsten snarled, kicking snow toward their meager fire. "All of you need to understand what happens to ungrateful children who bite the hand that feeds them." The youngest sister was indeed in desperate condition. Even from his concealed position above the camp, Asgeir could see the way Sigrid swayed where she sat, her small frame overwhelmed by cold and exhaustion. The other sisters had arranged themselves around her like a living shield, sharing what little warmth their bodies could provide, but it was clearly not enough. The wolf pommel seemed to pulse with life in Asgeir's grip, reminding him of the weapon's history and purpose. This sword had belonged to Magnus, who had received it from his own mentor in an unbroken chain stretching back generations. Each warrior who had carried it understood that its true power came not from its sharp edge, but from the justice it served. "Tomorrow we continue to the high pass," Torsten announced, his words carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Those who cannot keep pace will be left behind. The mountains have no mercy for the weak." The threat was unmistakable. By tomorrow night, he intended for some or all of the sisters to be dead from exposure, their deaths easily explained to any future investigation. He would return to Skarnfjord as the grieving uncle whose charges had perished despite his heroic efforts to save them. Asgeir began his descent with the silent movement of a trained killer. Years of warfare had taught him to move through terrain without disturbing so much as a pebble, to approach targets who would not know death was coming until it arrived. But this was different from any battle he had fought before. The enemy was not a foreign warrior, but a man who used family bonds to mask monstrous cruelty. The sisters' quiet conversation drifted up to him as he worked his way closer to their camp. "I still have it," Sigrid whispered, pulling the smooth river stone from her pocket with trembling fingers. "The courage stone Asgeir gave me. Do you think he knows where we are?" "I don't know, little sister," Astrid replied, though her voice carried a note of hope she was trying to suppress. "But if anyone could find us in these mountains, it would be him." Bergliot leaned closer to the fire, her gentle voice barely audible above the wind. "I keep thinking about what he said, that some things are worth risking everything for. Maybe he meant us." The twins nodded in unison, their shared glance speaking of faith that transcended rational expectation. Even Ragnhild, whose sharp intelligence usually focused on practical realities, seemed to draw comfort from the possibility that their protector had not abandoned them to their fate. Torsten's laughter was harsh and bitter. "Your precious warrior won't be coming for you," he said with cruel satisfaction. "By the time anyone realizes you're missing, you'll be buried under 10 feet of snow. And when spring comes, your bones will tell a story of tragic accident, not murder." "You're wrong," Astrid said quietly, her hand moving to the amber amulet beneath her dress. "He gave his word in the sight of gods and men. Such oaths are not easily broken." "Oaths," Torsten spat. "Pretty words that mean nothing when the speaker is safe and warm while others freeze in the mountains. Your faith in that exile is as foolish as your parents' trust in royal justice." The insult to his parents' memory struck the sisters like a physical blow, but it also kindled something in their eyes that Torsten failed to recognize, the beginning of defiant anger, replacing hopeless despair. Asgeir had heard enough. The time for stealth was ending, and the moment for action had arrived. The wolf pommel felt warm in his hand despite the bitter cold, as if the spirits of all the warriors who had carried it before him were lending their strength to what was about to unfold. He stepped into the circle of firelight like a figure from their shared prayers, his massive frame blocking out the stars behind him. Snow clung to his hair and beard, and his eyes held the cold fire of absolute determination. "You are wrong about many things, Torsten," Asgeir said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the mountain stillness. "But you are most wrong about this. I always keep my word." The sisters' faces transformed with such pure joy and relief that even the weak fire seemed to burn brighter. Sigrid clutched her courage stone to her chest and whispered, "I knew you'd come. I knew it." But Torsten's reaction was that of a cornered animal whose last escape route had been blocked. His hand moved toward the long knife at his belt, his face contorting with rage and desperate calculation. The blade of Torsten's long knife gleamed wickedly in the firelight as he pulled it from its sheath, the steel singing against leather with a sound like a serpent's hiss. His eyes had taken on the wild look of a man who understood that everything he had built through years of careful deception was crumbling around him, leaving only violence as his final tool. "Stay back," Torsten snarled, positioning himself between Asgeir and the sisters. "These girls are my responsibility, my family. You have no right to interfere with how I handle my own blood." "Your responsibility," Asgeir repeated, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated disgust. Is that what you call theft? Murder? The systematic destruction of children's spirits? The wolf pommel warmed in his grip, but Asgeir made no move to draw his sword. In the confined space of the mountain camp, with 6 exhausted girls huddled near the fire, steel against steel could endanger the very people he had come to save. This confrontation would require different weapons, words sharp enough to cut through years of lies and fear. "I saved them from starvation," Torsten insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I gave them shelter when no one else would take responsibility for orphaned children. You stole their inheritance and used their dependence to justify cruelty," Asgeir countered, taking a careful step forward. "You turned love into fear, protection into torment, family into prison." Around the dying fire, the sisters watched this battle of words with the intensity of spectators at a trial where their very lives hung in the balance. Astrid's hand found the amber amulet beneath her dress, drawing strength from her mother's memory. The twins pressed close together, their shared courage multiplying through contact. Ragnhild's intelligent eyes tracked every nuance of the confrontation, while Bergliot held little Sigrid protectively. The youngest sister clutched her courage stone so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "Lies," Torsten spat, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mountain cold. Poison poured into their ears by a stranger with no understanding of family loyalty. "The royal messenger's scroll contained no lies," Asgeir said quietly. "The king's court knows exactly what property your brother left behind. They know how much gold you've stolen, how many fields you've claimed illegally, how many years you've lived off wealth that belonged to these girls." The truth struck Torsten like a physical blow. His grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles cracked, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. The careful facade of righteous authority was stripping away to reveal the desperate criminal beneath. "You think royal justice means anything out here?" Torsten's voice rose to a near shriek. "We're alone in the mountains. Exile. No witnesses, no judges, no rescue. These girls will die tonight from the cold, and you'll die from this blade. Spring will tell whatever story I choose to tell." But as he spoke these words, the firelight caught something that made his blood run cold. Around the edges of the camp, barely visible in the darkness, other figures were moving into position. Henrik the fisherman emerged from behind a boulder, followed by Magnus the blacksmith and 3 other village men. They had followed Asgeir's trail through the mountains, driven by guilt over their long inaction and determination to set things right. "Actually," Henrik said quietly, "there are quite a few witnesses here tonight." Torsten's face went through several shades of rage and fear before settling on the pale color of a man who finally understood he was beaten. The knife trembled in his grip as he looked around the circle of men who had once called him Jarl, now standing in judgment of his crimes. "This is conspiracy," he whispered, "rebellion against lawful authority." "This is justice," Asgeir replied, finally allowing his hand to rest on his sword's hilt. Long delayed, but justice nonetheless. The confrontation hung balanced on a knife's edge for heartbeats that felt like hours. Torsten's desperation warred with his sense of self-preservation, while the assembled men waited to see if he would surrender to the inevitable or choose the futile violence of the cornered. It was Sigrid who broke the tension. Rising unsteadily to her feet, the 8-year-old girl walked slowly toward her uncle, the courage stone held out in her small palm like an offering. "Uncle," she said in a voice that carried more strength than her frail body should have been able to produce, "you don't have to hurt anyone else, you can just stop." The simple words from the smallest person present struck deeper than any weapon could have. Torsten stared down at his youngest niece, seeing perhaps for the first time the child she actually was, rather than the burden he had imagined her to be. The knife slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the rocky ground. Torsten collapsed onto his knees beside the dying fire, his face buried in his hands as 3 years of accumulated lies finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain them. "I never meant," he began, but could not finish the thought. Asgeir stepped forward and carefully kicked the fallen knife away from Torsten's reach. The wolf pommel pulsed once more in his grip, then seemed to settle into satisfied stillness. Justice had been served not through violence but through courage, the courage of a child who chose mercy over revenge. The mountain wind howled around their small camp, but the storm in their hearts had finally passed. The golden locket had belonged to their grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of strong women who had faced their own trials with grace and determination. Inside its delicate frame was a miniature portrait of their mother as a young bride, her eyes bright with hope and love for the future she was building. Astrid wore it openly now, no longer hiding treasures that connected her to better days, as she stood in the great hall that had once been their prison and was now truly their home. 6 months had passed since that night on the mountain when truth finally conquered deception. Spring had brought investigators from the royal court, men who spent weeks cataloguing the extent of Torsten's theft and documenting the abuse the sisters had endured. The property their father had left them proved even more valuable than anyone had suspected: fertile farmland, timber rights, and trading agreements that made them among the wealthiest young women in the northern territories. Torsten himself had been led away in chains, his fate to be decided by the king's justice. The village had chosen a new leader through proper counsel, selecting Henrik the fisherman for his wisdom and fair dealing. It was a choice that reflected how much Skarnfjord had changed. The days of rule through fear and intimidation were over, replaced by governance based on respect and mutual cooperation. The longhouse itself had been transformed under the sisters' guidance. Where once iron gauntlets had hung as symbols of oppression, now tapestries woven by their mother's hands decorated the walls. The great chair had been replaced with a simple wooden bench where any villager could sit while discussing community matters with the sisters, who had become their informal leaders through courage rather than force. Asgeir sat near the central fire, his journal open before him as he recorded the final chapter of their story. The leather volume was nearly full now, its pages documenting not just the rescue of 6 sisters, but the redemption of an entire community. Magnus would have been proud to see how the lessons he taught about leadership through service had borne fruit in this remote settlement. "What will you write about today?" Ragnhild asked, settling beside him with a book of her own, a treatise on governance she had requested from travelling merchants. Her hunger for knowledge, once suppressed by fear, now burned bright as any flame. "I write about new beginnings," Asgeir replied, his pen moving carefully across the parchment. "About how strength finds its truest expression when it protects rather than dominates." The twins were working together at a large table, reviewing trading contracts with the careful attention their father had once brought to such matters. Their natural business acumen, inherited through bloodlines Torsten had tried so hard to break, was proving invaluable as they rebuilt relationships with merchants and neighbors who had been alienated by years of poor leadership. Bergliot moved through the hall like a gentle breeze, ensuring that everyone felt welcome and cared for. She had become the sisters' unofficial ambassador to the village, her soft manner and genuine kindness healing wounds that went deeper than anyone had realized. The strength that had enabled her to write that crucial letter to the royal court now served to bridge gaps between people who had forgotten how to trust each other. Little Sigrid played near the fire with the doll that Asgeir had so carefully repaired. The blue fabric was brighter now, reinforced with new thread that made it stronger than before. She no longer needed the courage stone constantly. Its lesson had been internalized, becoming part of who she was, rather than something she needed to hold. But she kept it still, polished, smooth and warm, ready to share with other children who might need to remember that bravery often came in small packages. "The royal investigators asked me to consider a position at court," Astrid said, looking up from the correspondence she had been reading. "They believe our experience with—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "With recovering from difficult circumstances might help other families in similar situations." It was an honor none of them had expected. Recognition that their survival had taught them wisdom worth sharing. But it also represented a choice whether to leave Skarnfjord for the wider world or to continue rebuilding the community that had finally learned to protect its own. "What did you tell them?" Asgeir asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I told them we would consider it," Astrid replied, her hand moving unconsciously to the golden locket. "But that our first responsibility is here, to the people who finally found their courage to stand with us." The decision reflected how much they had all grown. A year ago, the sisters had been prisoners in their own home, dreaming only of escape. Now, they understood that true freedom came not from running away from responsibility, but from choosing which responsibilities to embrace. As evening settled over Skarnfjord, the sisters gathered around the fire as they had every night for months. But now their circle included others, village children who came for stories, elderly neighbors who found comfort in their company, young families who sought their counsel on matters both practical and profound. Asgeir closed his journal and set it aside, the final entry complete. Tomorrow he would begin a new volume, documenting the continuing story of a village learning to live without fear, of sisters who had transformed suffering into strength, of a community discovering that its greatest protection came from caring for its most vulnerable members. The golden locket caught the firelight as Astrid leaned forward to add wood to the flames, its tiny portrait seeming to smile approval at the scene before it. 3 generations of strong women looked down on their descendants, seeing in them the continuation of a legacy that no amount of cruelty could permanently break. Outside, snow began to fall in gentle patterns against the windows, but inside the longhouse, warmth and laughter filled spaces that had once echoed only with fear. The sisters had not merely survived their ordeal, they had transformed it into wisdom, their shared strength becoming a beacon of hope for anyone who needed to remember that love could triumph over hatred, that justice could emerge from the darkest circumstances, and that some bonds were stronger than any force that tried to break them. In the dancing flames of the central fire, the future glowed bright with possibility, and 6 sisters faced it together with the confidence of those who had learned that they were, and always had been, stronger than they knew.